There's a moment in every emotionally exhausting relationship where something inside you changes. Not loudly, not dramatically, quietly. You stop sending the long messages. You stop checking your phone every 5 minutes. You stop trying to decode mixed signals like they're encrypted military intelligence. And for the first time in a very long time, you become still. That moment is psychologically devastating to an avoidant. Because most people misunderstand avoidant behavior completely. They think avoidants want distance because they don't care. That's inaccurate. Avoidants often care deeply. But closeness creates internal tension for them. Emotional intimacy feels dangerous because it threatens autonomy, control, and emotional safety. So they develop a system. When someone moves toward them emotionally, they instinctively move away. Not always physically, sometimes psychologically. They delay texts. They become vague. They create confusion. They suddenly need space. They pull back right when connection deepens. And here's the part nobody tells you. The chase is what stabilizes the entire system. As long as you keep pursuing, explaining, reassuring, overanalyzing, and trying to repair the connection, the avoidant never has to fully confront the emotional consequences of distance. Your pursuit becomes emotional oxygen. You think you're fighting for the relationship, but psychologically, you're often protecting them from discomfort. Now here's where everything changes. The moment you stop chasing, the emotional equilibrium breaks. Suddenly, the avoidant can no longer predict the pattern. And human beings are deeply disturbed by broken patterns, especially avoidants, because avoidants rely heavily on emotional predictability to maintain internal control. They expect you to pursue after distance. They expect emotional pressure to continue. They expect the cycle to reset. But when you disappear emotionally, not through anger, games, or manipulation, but through genuine detachment, the avoidant experiences uncertainty. And uncertainty creates a tension. This is why many avoidants suddenly reappear after you finally let go. Not because they won, not because they stopped caring, but because your absence interrupts psychological certainty. Your silence becomes louder than your pursuit ever was. Now let's go deeper. Most people think NK avoidants are emotionally cold. Wrong. Avoidants are often emotionally overloaded. They suppress emotion because emotion feels destabilizing. So instead of processing feelings directly, they manage distance. That's why an avoidant can seem calm while disconnecting from someone they deeply value. But here's the catch. Suppressed emotion does not disappear. It waits. And when you stop chasing, distractions disappear too. There are no more emotional negotiations. No more reassurance from you. No more constant proof that you'll stay regardless of how little they invest. For the first time, the avoidant is left alone with emotional reality. And reality is uncomfortable, because now they have to answer questions they avoided before. What if this person actually leaves? What if I misjudged them? What if I pushed too far? What if I lost someone emotionally important? That's when the mind starts replaying memories, not the dramatic moments, the quiet ones, the consistency, the loyalty, the emotional safety you provided. And ironically, avoidants often feel connection most intensely after distance occurs. Why? Because distance lowers emotional pressure. When why? You chased them. Closeness felt overwhelming. But when you stopped chasing, the pressure vanished. Now they can miss you safely. That's the paradox of avoidant psychology. Too much closeness triggers fear. Too much distance triggers longing. And many people spend years trapped between those two extremes. But there's something even more important here. Stopping the chase doesn't just affect the avoidant. It transforms you. Because chasing someone emotionally unavailable slowly destroys your nervous system. You begin abandoning yourself in small ways. You over-explain. You tolerate inconsistency. You minimize your needs. You confuse anxiety with love. And eventually your emotional world revolves around one question. How do I make this person choose me? That question is dangerous. Because the moment your self-worth becomes dependent on someone else's emotional availability, you surrender your psychological center. Now your peace depends on their mood. Their response time controls your emotions. Their inconsistency becomes your addiction. And intermittent reinforcement is one of the strongest psychological conditioning systems in existence. Not constant reward. UNP. Predictable reward. That's what keeps people emotionally trapped. Sometimes the avoidant is warm. Sometimes distant. Sometimes affectionate. Sometimes unreachable. Your brain becomes obsessed with recovering connection because uncertainty intensifies attachment. Casinos understand this principle perfectly. So do emotionally inconsistent relationships. Now here's the truth most people don't want to hear. The moment you stop chasing, you finally regain leverage over your own mind. Not leverage over them, over yourself. And that's real power. Because now your emotional state no longer depends entirely on their behavior. You stop monitoring every signal. You stop interpreting breadcrumbs as commitment. You stop mistaking potential for reality. And something fascinating happens next. The avoidant often begins moving toward you. Not always consciously. Sometimes subtly. A text. A reaction online. A casual check-in. A sudden emotional openness that never existed before. Why? Because human beings value what feels emotionally uncertain. And for the first time, you are no longer emotionally guaranteed. But this is where people make the biggest mistake. The avoidant ret earns with small effort, and the chaser immediately resumes old behavior. Instant availability, emotional overinvestment, desperation disguised as affection, and the cycle restarts. Nothing changes because the psychology underneath never changed. Real transformation only happens when your standards change too. Not through punishment, through clarity. You begin recognizing that love without emotional consistency creates confusion, not security. You realize chemistry is not compatibility. Intensity is not intimacy. Longing is not connection. And attention is not commitment. That awareness changes everything, because now you stop asking, how do I keep this person interested? And you start asking, does this relationship actually feel emotionally healthy? That question shifts your entire nervous system from survival mode into discernment. Now let's address the final piece nobody talks about. Sometimes when you stop chasing an avoidant, they do nothing. No return. No realization. No emotional breakthrough. And that silence tells you everything. Because if a relationship only survives through your effort, it was never truly mutual to begin with. Painful truth. B.U.T. liberating. Your pursuit may have been carrying the entire emotional structure. And once you stop, reality becomes visible. That visibility is not failure. It's clarity. Because clarity is always kinder than false hope. Always. And eventually you understand something powerful. The goal was never to make the avoidant love you harder. The goal was to stop abandoning yourself just to receive fragments of love. That realization changes your life, because emotionally healthy relationships do not require constant pursuit to maintain connection. They require reciprocity, consistency, mutual emotional investment. And when you finally stop chasing an avoidant, one of two things happens. Either they begin confronting the emotional distance they created, or you finally see that your peace matters more than the cycle. Both outcomes set you free. An avoidant rarely pulls away because they feel nothing. In many cases, they pull away because they feel too much, too fast, and too intensely. Most people misunderstand this behavior and interpret distance as indifference, but psychologically, avoidants often experience emotional closeness as pressure instead of comfort. The mom. Not a relationship begins demanding vulnerability, consistency, or deeper emotional connection. Their nervous system can start reacting as if their freedom is under threat. What feels natural and reassuring to another person can feel overwhelming to someone with avoidant attachment patterns. For an avoidant, intimacy is complicated. Deep down, many of them learned early in life that depending on others was unsafe, disappointing, or emotionally consuming. As a result, they developed a survival strategy centered around self-reliance and emotional control. They learned to regulate discomfort by creating distance. This distance becomes their way of restoring psychological balance whenever emotions begin to feel too intense. So when someone starts chasing them, demanding reassurance, or trying to force clarity, the avoidant mind interprets it as increasing emotional pressure rather than love. This is why the more emotionally available you become, the more they sometimes withdraw. It creates a confusing paradox for the person pursuing them. The chaser thinks, if I show more love, more patience, more loyalty, they'll finally feel safe enough to open up. But the avoidant often experiences that increased attention as emotional suffocation. They may start feeling responsible for another person's emotional needs, expectations, or happiness, and that responsibility activates their instinct to escape. Pulling away becomes a way to regain control over their emotional environment. You'll often notice avoidants becoming distant right after moments of genuine closeness. After a vulnerable conversation, a deep emotional connection, or a period of intimacy, they suddenly become harder to reach. Texts slow down. Energy changes. Affection becomes inconsistent. This shift is not always calculated or malicious. In many cases, it's an unconscious attempt to regulate internal anxiety. Closeness triggered emotional exposure, and now they need distance to feel emotionally safe again. The mistake most people make is responding to this withdrawal with more pursuit. They send longer messages, ask more questions, seek reassurance, or try to fix the distance immediately. But this often intensifies the avoidant's need to retreat even further. Why? Because the more they feel emotionally cornered, the stronger their desire becomes to regain independence and control. What the pursuer sees, as effort, the avoidant experiences as pressure. Avoidants are highly sensitive to feeling trapped emotionally. Even healthy expectations can sometimes feel overwhelming to them if they have not developed emotional security within themselves. They may deeply care about someone while simultaneously feeling an urge to escape from the emotional intensity of the relationship. That contradiction confuses both people involved. One person moves closer to create connection, while the other moves away to create relief. The tragic part is that this dynamic creates a cycle where both people unintentionally trigger each other's fears. The more one person chases connection, the more the avoidant distances themselves. And the more the avoidant distances themselves, the more the other person pursues. Over time, the relationship becomes less about love and more about emotional survival patterns operating beneath the surface. One of the most painful realities in relationships with avoidant people is that the harder you try to repair the connection, the more you may unintentionally strengthen the very behavior that hurts you. Most people enter these situations believing love, patience, reassurance, and emotional effort will eventually break through the avoidance walls. They think if they explain themselves clearly enough, stay loyal long enough, or prove their value consistently enough, the avoidant will finally feel safe and begin showing up emotionally. But psychology does not always reward effort the way people expect. In many cases, constant pursuit actually teaches the avoidant that emotional distance carries no real cost. When someone repeatedly withdraws, becomes inconsistent, or avoids emotional accountability, and the other person continues chasing anyway, a powerful pattern forms beneath the surface. The avoidant unconsciously learns that the relationship will survive regardless of how little emotional investment they provide. They begin expecting the other person to repair disconnection every single time tension appears. Over time, emotional imbalance becomes normalized. One person carries the emotional labor while the other maintains distance without facing meaningful consequences. This is not always manipulative or intentional. Most avoidants are not sitting around planning emotional strategies. Many are operating from deeply ingrained survival mechanisms developed long before the relationship began. But unconscious patterns can still shape behavior in powerful ways. If every withdrawal is followed by reassurance, every cold moment is met with increased affection, and every emotional shutdown is rewarded with patience and pursuit, the avoidant nervous system adapts to that reality. Distance becomes safe because someone else constantly compensates for it. The pursuing partner often mistakes this cycle for commitment. They believe their willingness to fight for the relationship proves the depth of their love. But slowly, their emotional energy begins functioning like protection from consequences. The avoidant never fully experiences what their absence creates because the pursuer rushes in to stabilize the connection before discomfort can settle. Every time tension appears, the pursuer over-explains, apologizes, checks in, or tries to reconnect emotionally. As a result, the avoidant is rarely forced to confront the weight of their own emotional unavailability. This creates a dangerous dynamic where inconsistency becomes sustainable. The avoidant learns they can disappear emotionally and still maintain access to connection, affection, and validation whenever they return. The relationship starts revolving around emotional recovery instead of mutual emotional presence. One person constantly repairs while the other constantly retreats. And because the cycle repeats over and over, it begins feeling normal even though it slowly drains the emotional health of both people involved. The tragedy is that the pursuer usually believes they are saving the relationship while unknowingly feeding the instability. They think more love will create security, but emotional overinvestment often removes the urgency for the avoidant to grow. Human behavior adapts to what it can continue getting away with emotionally. If someone never risks losing connection despite minimal effort, there is little internal pressure to change their relational patterns. Over time, the pursuer becomes exhausted. Their self-worth becomes tied to keeping the relationship alive. They monitor moods, analyze messages, and constantly search for ways to prevent distance from happening again. Meanwhile, the avoidant remains emotionally insulated from the full impact of their behavior because the other person keeps absorbing the emotional consequences for both of them. This is why stepping back changes the dynamic so dramatically. When pursuit stops, the avoidant no longer has guaranteed emotional access without effort. For the first time, silence replaces reassurance. Distance is no longer softened by someone chasing after them. And suddenly, the emotional reality they once avoided becomes impossible to ignore. Silence is one of the most misunderstood forces in human psychology. Most people see silence as absence, weakness, or emotional surrender, but in relationships with avoidant individuals, silence can completely disrupt the emotional system that kept the connection operating for so long. When you finally stop chasing, something psychologically significant happens. The pattern breaks. And once the pattern breaks, the emotional balance of the relationship changes immediately. Avoidants often rely more on predictability than people realize. Even when they appear distant, detached, or emotionally unavailable, they usually become accustomed to a certain relational cycle. They expect pursuit after withdrawal. They expect reassurance after distance. They expect emotional availability from the person who continually fights to maintain the connection. That predictability becomes emotionally stabilizing for them because it allows them to control closeness without truly risking loss. As long as the other person keeps chasing, the avoidant remains psychologically comfortable. They may not feel fully connected, but they feel secure in knowing the relationship is still accessible whenever they choose to re-engage. The pursuer becomes emotionally dependable in a way that unintentionally removes uncertainty from the avoidance world. Even after conflict, cold behavior, or emotional disappearance, the avoidant learns that the connection will likely remain intact because the other person will eventually return, explain, apologize, or try again. But the moment that pursuit stops, the entire emotional structure becomes unstable. Silence interrupts certainty. For the first time, the avoidant no longer knows what happens next. There is no emotional reassurance arriving to stabilize the distance they created. No long message appears trying to repair the connection. No attempt is made to pull them back emotionally. And that absence becomes psychologically loud because human beings are highly sensitive to broken expectations. When a familiar emotional pattern suddenly disappears, attention intensifies immediately. This is why avoidants often seem more curious, reactive, or emotionally aware after someone genuinely detaches. The silence forces them to confront unpredictability, and unpredictability creates discomfort. Before, they could maintain emotional distance while still relying on the security of someone chasing them. Now, that emotional safety net is gone. The relationship no longer feels controlled. It feels uncertain. And uncertainty creates emotional movement. For many avoidants, this becomes the first moment they truly feel the possibility of loss. While the pursuer was constantly present, the avoidant could suppress deeper emotions because the connection always felt available. But silence changes perception. Suddenly, the person they relied on emotionally is no longer reaching toward them. That creates psychological space for reflection. Memories begin resurfacing. Emotional dependence becomes more visible. The avoidant starts noticing the absence of the energy that once surrounded them constantly. What makes silence so powerful is that it removes pressure while simultaneously creating awareness. During pursuit, the avoidant often feels emotionally crowded. The constant attempts to reconnect activate their instinct to retreat, but silence removes that emotional pressure completely. There are no demands, no expectations, no emotional negotiations. And in that quiet space, the avoidant can finally experience their own emotions without feeling controlled by someone else's needs. This is why many avoidants return only after the chase has ended. Not because they suddenly transformed overnight, but because the emotional environment changed. The silence disrupted the pattern they unconsciously depended on. Your absence forced them to emotionally process what your constant presence once allowed them to avoid. But the deeper shift is not just happening inside the avoidant. It's happening inside you. When you stop chasing, you reclaim emotional control over your own nervous system. Your thoughts stop revolving entirely around their responses, moods, and inconsistencies. The emotional power dynamic changes because your peace no longer depends on forcing connection. Instead of reacting constantly to their distance, you become emotionally still. And emotional stillness is something avoidants rarely expect from the people who once pursued them relentlessly. That stillness changes everything because for the first time, the relationship is no longer operating entirely on your effort alone. One of the strangest dynamics in relationships with avoidant people is that they often seem to recognize your value more clearly after you stop being constantly available. While most people associate love with closeness, reassurance, and emotional consistency, avoidants frequently become desensitized to what is always accessible. Your constant presence slowly blends into the emotional background of their life. The texts, the check-ins, the emotional effort, the patience, the reassurance, all of it becomes expected rather than deeply felt. This does not necessarily mean they are ungrateful or malicious. It means the human mind adapts quickly to emotional certainty, especially in people who are uncomfortable with intimacy. For avoidants, constant availability can unintentionally reduce emotional awareness because there is no risk of loss attached to the connection. They begin assuming you will remain there no matter how distant they become. The relationship starts feeling emotionally permanent, even if they contribute inconsistently to it. And when something feels guaranteed, the mind often stops examining its value carefully. Presence becomes predictable. Predictability becomes normal. Normality fades into the background. This is where many people become trapped emotionally. They believe increasing effort will increase appreciation. So they give more attention, more understanding, more emotional labor, and more access to themselves. But psychologically, overavailability can create diminishing emotional impact. When someone never experiences your absence, they rarely confront what your presence actually means to them. Avoidants especially tend to process emotions indirectly rather than in the moment. During constant closeness, they may feel pressure, expectation, or emotional overload instead of longing. Their focus often shifts toward maintaining personal space and emotional control. But when distance finally appears, something changes internally. The emotional pressure disappears, and with it comes room for reflection. Silence creates contrast, and contrast creates awareness. When you are no longer constantly reaching out, reassuring, tiding, or emotionally available, the avoidant suddenly notices the missing emotional energy that once surrounded them. The routines disappear. The emotional safety net weakens. The person who consistently carried the connection is no longer actively maintaining it. And that absence becomes impossible to ignore because the human brain notices change far more intensely than consistency. This is why avoidants often seem emotionally delayed. They may not fully process attachment while the relationship is active and emotionally intense. But once distance enters the picture, reflection begins. They start remembering the small things they overlooked before. The consistency, the comfort, the emotional reliability, the feeling of someone genuinely caring about them despite their walls. Ironically, they often access these emotions more clearly in absence than they did in constant connection. Part of this happens because absence removes immediate emotional demands. When someone is constantly pursuing closeness, the avoidant nervous system can become focused on escaping pressure rather than appreciating connection. But when that person steps away, the avoidant no longer feels emotionally cornered. Now there is space to miss them without feeling controlled by them. Space to think without needing to defend independence. Space to emotionally process without reacting against pressure. Human beings are naturally drawn toward what becomes uncertain. What is constantly available loses intensity because the brain stops treating it as emotionally urgent. But emotional distance reactivates attention. Suddenly, the avoidant begins wondering what changed, why the silence feels different, whether the connection is truly disappearing. Curiosity replaces complacency. This does not mean absence is a manipulation tactic. Genuine detachment is very different from calculated withdrawal designed to provoke a reaction. Healthy distance is about reclaiming emotional balance, not creating games. But psychologically, absence often reveals emotional truths that constant presence hides. It forces both people to confront reality without distraction. And for avoidance, reality often becomes loudest in silence. Because once your energy is no longer constantly surrounding them, they are left alone with the emotional space your presence used to fill. There comes a point in emotionally exhausted, NG relationships, where continuing to chase no longer feels like love. It feels like survival. You keep trying to restart conversations, repair emotional distance, explain your feelings calmly, stay patient during inconsistency, and hold the relationship together with sheer emotional effort. At first, you convince yourself that persistence is proof of commitment. You believe that if you just love harder, understand deeper, or remain loyal longer, eventually the avoidant will recognize your value and meet you halfway. But eventually something becomes impossible to ignore. The relationship only moves forward when you push it forward. That realization is painful because it forces you to confront a question you may have avoided for a long time. Is this relationship truly mutual? Or is it surviving mainly because you refuse to let it die? When you finally stop chasing, reality surfaces very quickly. The emotional fog clears. The constant activity that once distracted both people disappears, and what remains becomes impossible to hide. Without your effort constantly stabilizing the connection, the true structure of the relationship reveals itself. Either the avoidant begins moving towards genuine emotional engagement, or the silence exposes that the relationship depended almost entirely on your pursuit. This is why stepping back feels so emotionally intense. Chasing creates motion, and motion creates hope. As long as you are texting, explaining, reconnecting, or trying again, it feels like something is happening. The activity itself becomes emotionally addictive because it delays clarity. You stay focused on fixing the relationship instead of evaluating whether the relationship is actually functioning in a healthy way. But once you stop, there is nowhere left for reality to hide. For some avoidants, this becomes a turning point. The absence of pursuit forces them to emotionally confront what they were taking for granted. They begin recognizing the emotional labor you consistently provided. They notice the silence where reassurance used to exist. They feel the instability created by your withdrawal of effort. And for the first time, they may start moving toward the relationship voluntarily instead of simply reacting to your pursuit. Genuine effort appears. Conversations become clearer. Emotional openness increases. Not because they were manipulated into caring. Because the loss of certainty finally activated awareness. This is the healthiest possible outcome because it creates balance. Instead of one person carrying the emotional weight alone, both people begin participating in maintaining connection. The avoidant starts confronting their own fears rather than relying on your constant patience to compensate for them. The relationship becomes more honest because effort is now mutual instead of one-sided. But sometimes the opposite happens. Sometimes you stop chasing and nothing changes. No effort appears. No curiosity emerges. No movement toward connection happens. And while that silence hurts deeply, it also reveals something important that constant pursuit kept hidden. The relationship may have been sustained primarily by your emotional labor all along. Your texts maintained communication. Your patience maintained closeness. Your forgiveness maintained access. Your effort created the illusion of emotional connection even while reciprocity remained limited. This truth can feel devastating because it forces you to grieve not only the person, but the fantasy of what you hoped the relationship could become. Many people stay at the attaché, to avoidance, not because of what the relationship consistently is, but because of its potential. They become emotionally invested in rare moments of intimacy, occasional vulnerability, or glimpses of connection that suggest deeper love might eventually emerge. But potential is not the same as reality. Stopping the chase removes the fantasy and exposes the facts. And while clarity can feel brutal at first, it is ultimately freeing. Because once reality surfaces, you no longer waste years trying to earn consistency from someone unwilling or unable to provide it. You stop confusing emotional crumbs with genuine partnership. You stop carrying an entire relationship alone while calling it love. Most importantly, you begin understanding that healthy relationships do not require endless pursuit to survive. Real connection involves mutual effort, emotional accountability, and consistent presence from both people. When only one person is fighting for closeness, the relationship eventually becomes emotionally unsustainable. So when you stop chasing, one of two things happens. Either the avoidant rises to meet the relationship with genuine intention, or the silence confirms that your fort was the only thing holding it together. Both outcomes hurt in different ways, but both reveal the truth. And truth, even when painful, is what finally allows healing to begin. Detachment is often misunderstood, especially in emotionally confusing relationships. People hear the word and immediately imagine coldness, games, revenge, or emotional manipulation. They think detaching means pretending not to care in order to regain power over someone else. But true detachment is not about controlling another person's behavior. It is about finally regaining control over your own emotional well-being. It is the moment you stop sacrificing your peace just to keep a connection alive. When someone spends a long time chasing an avoidant, they slowly lose emotional balance without even realizing it. Their mind becomes consumed with questions, uncertainty, and emotional monitoring. They overanalyze text messages, replay conversations, and search constantly for signs of reassurance. Their emotional state starts depending entirely on another person's level of availability. A delayed response ruins their mood. A brief moment of affection creates temporary relief. Emotional inconsistency, be calm, is the center of their mental world. This is why detachment is not cruelty. It is self-preservation. At some point, you realize the relationship is pulling you away from yourself. You stop feeling emotionally grounded. Your self-worth begins rising and falling based on another person's attention. You become hyper-focused on maintaining connection at any cost. And the most dangerous part is that this process happens gradually. Nobody wakes up one day intending to abandon their dignity for emotional crumbs. It happens slowly through repeated cycles of hope, disappointment, temporary closeness, and emotional withdrawal. True detachment begins when you finally understand that constantly chasing someone who resists emotional intimacy is damaging your nervous system. You recognize that your anxiety is no longer coming from love itself, but from instability. You are exhausted from trying to decode mixed signals, prove your value, and earn consistency from someone who gives it only occasionally. In that moment, detachment stops being about them and starts becoming about you. The goal is not to make them come back. That mindset is still emotionally dependent because your focus remains centered on controlling their reaction. Many people confuse strategic withdrawal with genuine detachment. They pull away hoping the avoidant will panic, chase them, or suddenly realize their worth. But internally, they are still emotionally trapped because their peace still depends on getting a response. Real detachment is different. Real detachment says, I can no longer abandon myself trying to hold on to someone who continually creates confusion in my life. That shift is powerful because it restores emotional clarity. Instead of asking, how do I get them to choose me? You begin asking healthier questions. Why am I tolerating emotional inconsistency? Why do I keep fighting for people who resist connection? Why does this relationship require me to constantly betray my own needs just to maintain it? Those questions lead back to self-respect. Self-respect means recognizing that love should not require endless emotional chasing. It means understanding that your value is not determined by someone's inability to connect consistently. It means accepting that no amount of loyalty, patience, or emotional labor can force another person to become emotionally available before tea, hay are ready. Detachment also creates emotional honesty. When you stop chasing, you stop living inside fantasy and start confronting reality. You stop attaching yourself to potential and begin evaluating actual behavior. You no longer confuse occasional affection with commitment or temporary vulnerability with lasting emotional maturity. The relationship becomes clearer because you are no longer clouded by desperation to make it work. And ironically, this is often when emotional peace returns. Not because everything suddenly stops hurting, but because your nervous system is no longer trapped inside constant uncertainty. You stop obsessing over every emotional shift. You stop waiting for text to determine your mood. You stop carrying the impossible responsibility of keeping the connection alive alone. Detachment is not bitterness. It is acceptance. It is the understanding that you cannot heal another person by abandoning yourself. You cannot build emotional safety with someone who consistently avoids emotional accountability. And you cannot create a healthy relationship through effort alone. Most importantly, detachment restores dignity. You begin standing emotionally upright. T again. Instead of begging for closeness, you start protecting your peace. Instead of trying to convince someone to love you consistently, you begin realizing that real love should not require convincing in the first place. That is why true detachment is not manipulation. It is the decision to stop losing yourself in relationships that only survive when you ignore your own emotional needs.